This is the CNCF Cross-Cloud CI project intro. We're also having a deep dive on Friday, if y'all are interested, if you've had more in-depth information. This is going to go over a little bit of everything. I'm Taylor, and we'll go over why we're here, what it's about, a little bitty demo, small part of the project, some of the technology behind it, and what we're planning to do, and then Q&A. So here's the team, some of us that are here. Denver,
Hey.
Co-founder and CI working group for the CI working group, as well as the Cross-Cloud project. Watson, API development on the project. Lucina, product owner, she's here, and a few of the other folks. So why are we here? We've been hearing a lot about this, the growth in CNCF across the board, new clouds, partners, integrations, all the projects, everything coming on. And we have a goal of trying to show the interoperability between all the projects, as well as how they work across all the cloud providers. And this project is trying to meet that goal as a whole, the idea. It's a complementary CI system. So we're kind of in the middle ground between your CI systems per project and then CD for going production, and tying in between those. We have a CI system that's composable. We can do builds, we can do integration tests, provisioning of Kubernetes, and then we have a status repository that has an API that talks to the different systems, and then has an API for gathering those results, as well as a dashboard for showing those. We're wanting to target all of the CNCF projects, as well as external projects like ONAP, Linux Foundation project. All the cloud providers, right now we support quite a few, as well as Packet, where we're doing raw hardware, OpenStack. Let me go ahead and show you the dashboard itself, pop out of here. So this is the dashboard that's showing the results of the different runs. We have all the projects that we currently have on this particular dashboard, as well as, so we have Kubernetes, that's what's going to be provisioned, and then the different projects that are going to be deployed on Kubernetes. And then you can see across here the different cloud providers, AWS, Google Cloud. We have the Packet for the bare metal, and OpenStack. And we have the status of the provisioning for stable and head, releases of Kubernetes, and how those deployments went to each of the clouds. And then we either build the source for the different projects, or we pull the artifacts if a external system like ONAP already builds artifacts and creates containers. Then we integrate with those, validate that the containers are available, and we can pull them down, check the status of, say, ONAP, their Jenkins. This is actually an upstream. We were just checking it this morning. Their head build failed, so we're showing that. And then we deploy those across each of the clouds. So I'm going to switch over to a CI dev environment and kick off one of these. Normally we would have run an app deploy, but we had the production running an hour and a half ago, so didn't want to bother that. So I'm starting the provisioning, which if we go over here, well, you can already see it. So back-end platform here, this is in GitLab. You can see some of the pipelines kicking off as that API client started those. So what it's doing is taking the builds that we started earlier this morning for this environment, and it takes all those artifacts for Kubernetes, and it's going to start provisioning it. This would be very similar whenever we do, we can see here it's starting to go through. When we do the app deploys, it would go and get all the artifacts for those. And for OwnApp, it would actually go into the Nexus registry that they run and download the containers and use the Helm charts that we semi-maintain together. They have some, and sometimes we have to update them. And it goes through. Let's go back over here. So again, that's the build pipeline, the cloud provisioning, and app deployment, those different parts. And they're all composable and optional. Each of them create artifacts like an environment configuration with the pinning between all of the different pieces. So you can specify different versions of the software. With Kubernetes, you could say it's enabling all these different flags. So if you're testing specific storage things, and those would be artifacts. The build pipeline stage, that's your traditional compile, get everything together. We create those pinning files. We also put everything in a container, making that available and push it into a registry that's available to use. And for Kubernetes, then we take all the pieces, we do the provisioning of Kubernetes on the cloud providers, allocate the actual VMs or the hardware with Packet, whatever we need, provision Kubernetes, and then move on to the next stage, app deployment. We use Helm to deploy all the apps. And that's about it there. So technology overview. This is GitLab, that's what we were looking at earlier for the underlying, and we use that primarily for its runners. It happens to do mirroring of repos and some other things that you could take advantage of. We use it, again, primarily for the runners and workers and triggering those, and then it runs the underlying items like Terraform for the cloud provisioning. This is where we come in and allocate the resources on all the cloud providers. It makes it real easy to maintain a large set using community maintained modules. Cloud Init, where we pass all the metadata, and that's then creates all the manifests for Kubernetes that are laid down on the disk. App deployments, again, are Helm, and then we use E2E tests as much as possible upstream, and sometimes those are in a container. With OwnApp, they actually have their own set of containers, and we can start specifying what we want to run in there. That dashboard that we're looking at is Vue.js app, and it's fully configurable for what projects and everything would be used and seen. And then the status repository is Erlang Elixir, and again, that talks to the back end, like whatever the CI system, and pulls information out of there. We can push stuff into it, and then it has an API for the dashboard and other things to use. So we've been around a little over a year. Started back in February of last year, and part of the CI working group to get this started. And the first demos that we did were around the GitLab system and its pipelines, and then gathered feedback and had the dashboard released in January. That was after the KubeCon Austin. We had a little pre-release, if anyone was there for that, seeing there. And then we've been adding lots of projects and clouds and stuff. We added OwnApp and OpenStack in March, which were pretty cool because those were pretty different from your standard clouds, as well as the external integration with the CI system. Here's some of the projects we're going to be adding. Some that we may be adding, some we're going to be working with the community. They may be helping. Oracle, Huawei, we've had a lot of help from some of the cloud providers. They're starting to work with us to add their own, so we'll be adding these. And ARM support's probably going to be coming via Packet, and then potentially some other options as well. So right now, probably the biggest things here for coming up next would be API access external. It is public right now. We've had a lot of feedback, though, on what queries folks would want rather than potentially using the dashboard directly. if you want to query the API and say, I want to know this Prometheus, how it works on AWS for all stable releases, and being able to track that, and if it breaks, then you could flag it internally. So looking at stuff like that on the API, potentially being able to push stuff in from other CI systems. So that's something that we're looking at, as well as the dashboard itself, looking at some potential changes. I'll go back over there and talk to that for a moment. So right now, this overview screen, we have the provisioning and kind of the Kubernetes layer, where you may have a lot of other pieces like Rook and other things that would tie right into the storage, versus pieces like maybe Core DNS or something sitting on top that we may end up splitting out. We're also looking at pulling more data from the underlying CI system, since we have access and it's behind the scenes. So say ONAP, which has Jenkins and the data from the output there, making that visible here would be something we're looking at. Collaborating a lot, community, to try to get feedback, because this is a complementary CI. It's not taking over. It's supposed to work with an existing CI, wherever that is, using end-to-end test. A lot of what we do is helping to make the end-to-end test more external to the project. So as a user, what would I do trying to validate the system, versus internally when you know your system and how you set it up. But if I'm going to download the software, then how's it going to work? So we're trying to do that kind of external validation and help. So working with a lot of communities, Prometheus and Core DNS specifically, have really wanted to help with those end-to-end tests. Prometheus a lot on the performance side. So again, deep dive Friday. We're going to be going specifically into the provisioning side. So that's the cross-cloud component, multi-cloud. And there is a CI working group. It's the 4th Tuesday of the month. So if anyone would like to join that one. That's about it for this. Go into the Q&A. And I think we have a mic if anyone has questions.
I can see that you have the backend and the ARM for the architecture. If I wanted to add more architectures other than x86 or ARM, how will I do that? Or do I need to put an OpenStack on top of it? How you probably will go with that?
Do you want to answer that?
So to do that, I mean, the first step, the Kubernetes builds would have to be for that architecture. So you'd have to add another GitLab pipeline or a job that would actually compile Kubernetes for the right architecture. And then the next step for doing that would be adding the provisioning code. So your ARM, say it's an ARM cluster or whatever architecture cluster, you could have provisioning to do bare metal for those machines, or the alternatives, you've got some virtualization like OpenStack on top. And as long as you can provision a compute node and have it handed off, so then CloudNet takes over and goes, okay, a machine's ready for me, here's the CloudNet data, and then the cluster would be up. And then that's something that, once the Kubernetes cluster's there provisioned, you can have it ported over, these other projects can then take use of it. But you also have the other battle of Prometheus would have to be compiled for that architecture, as well as Core DNS, Fluentd, and anything you were trying to run on top of it.
Okay. And if I want to do that, do I need to work with you directly, or there is a community page where I can come in and then integrate my infrastructure under that CI?
You could add all of that by submitting pull requests. So where Taylor's going right now is where the configuration or the code sits, and there's basically the ones that have a hyphen configuration at the end. Basically the GitLab YAML defining what happens, and you can add extra entries that would add those jobs to happen. And then there's cross-cloud, which is where you'd add the code to actually support that architecture to provision.
So this is the overall org, and you can find all the different repos, but this gives an overview. And then the The build stage was the configuration that he was talking about. That's tied in with your CI YAML file that you would find in, could be in an upstream project if it's integrated. Otherwise, we just add it in our own repo as an external. And cross-cloud would be if you're wanting to add support for ARM. That might be a good place to start, or some specific architecture. Go in here and look at the provisioner, and this will be where you focus on Kubernetes. And if you're wanting help, probably creating an issue. Right now we're trying to keep them in the top level. So this is the cross-cloud CI. Just go in here and create an issue. We're also on Slack and the CI working group mailing list, so, or if you want to reach out. Any other questions?
So currently this is focused on Cloud Native Computing Foundation projects. Do you have any long-term plans to make this into a, well, full solution which you can use, which you can run on premise for your own applications? Or how hard is it to do this actually currently?
Right now, it would be could be a bit difficult to do, but entirely doable. But eventually it would be nice, or we have plans to get a Docker Compose file somewhere in a repo that just would be a Docker Compose app and would bring up the exact same infrastructure that would do exactly what it's doing here, but you could specify the domains you want it under, and then you'd be able to add your own repos that were to your own apps or whatever you wanted to use, and you'd be able to add GitLab configuration to build them and deploy it and test.
The hard part right now is the GitLab piece, which is another part that we're going to be focused on besides the API and stuff I was talking about. And we're looking at some other solutions to split that out. We've been separating quite a bit, so now we're kind of just sitting on top. If you already had GitLab deployment, then you would be a long way. So if you go into like the cross-cloud and some of the other parts, you could use these right now, and they actually have how to run it in Docker and stuff. So what's the harder part is a GitLab setup to run everything. The dashboard and everything else, you could take right now and, if I go over here. So the dashboard is actually all configured in, where is it, CNCF configuration. There it is. So this one repo, it primarily just has this YAML file, and here's the clouds that we want to target, and then here's the projects and some information about those. So you can actually, if you fork this, you could create your own and use the dashboard and the status repository as well as cross-cloud and cross-project, which is what deploys all the apps. So it's the GitLab portion that ties it all in to where we can say trigger it and run a full pipeline and everything else. The pieces themselves are all usable right now, though.
If you're contemplating multiple, it's now GitLab CI based. Are you contemplating more CI toolings to use as a plugin or pipeline based?
For the underlying CI system? Okay, so the question was, are we contemplating other CI systems for that base layer besides GitLab? Yes, we are. We've been specifically looking most recently at Spinnaker. And so I wouldn't really think CI, but more of that worker, runner, and some of the other things. And that would be a big help. So we've been talking with them a lot and starting to look at how that could work and spin up systems pretty easily. And that would tie in with the Docker Compose stuff that Denver was talking about.
So this is really cool, and just I have to say, like, really important work that you guys are doing. So thank you. Being able to show that we can run software across any cloud is key to most of my customers. One of the questions I have, you have a lot of the market covered just with the clouds that you cover today. How do we add sort of the long tail of cloud computing, sort of all the strange regional or custom clouds that we have around the world?
So that would tie in with specifically this cross-cloud component and this repo. And so from this dashboard that I'm showing right here, this is the CNCF CI dashboard. So this is probably going to be focused on what CNCF needs to show or wants to show here. And if you wanted any other dashboard, then again, you could show that. As far as the system and testing, I think we would want to be able to test on a lot more. It may be that we say we're going to test these other cloud providers that not as many people, maybe we only test them once a week or something like that. But what it would be going in here and adding them in here. So OpenStack was one where it wasn't an immediate target for us, but we were able to get it on via help from folks in the OpenStack community, like Chris Hodge. And so most of the work was done by them. We met, actually, I think the working session was KubeCon Austin.
Yeah, it was.
And got that going. And then he did a whole bunch of work. We had a couple other sessions, and then we were able to get it integrated, and now it's part of it. So I think it'd be something like that. You'd look at something, and then we could point you at, here's a good example to start with. We'll be updating the README and stuff to more as we get feedback, but that'd be it. Any other questions?
Where do the binaries go to afterwards once you build it? Is it part of the CNCF repo?
So the question is, where do the binaries go to? So right now, we're pushing them to GitLab. It has a repository built in. Could go anywhere, but that's where they're going right now, and they're all public. So the artifacts from the build stage go there. ONAP, we don't right now because they're external. The actual pinning configuration and stuff for the deploys, all of that information gets pushed in to GitLab. Any other questions?
Yeah, I mean, from official
Mm-hmm.
image perspective, you post it in Docker Hub, or do you post it in some other location? Or do we go and send this official image from the CNCF CI2?
Yeah.
Download the binary rather than somebody else pretending.
Okay. So as far as, so the question was official images from the CNCF CI team. So right now we're not pushing them to somewhere like Docker Hub or anything where we've had the first full release of all the components started this year, and it's moving out of beta, so we're getting feedback and stuff like that, but we're not pushing them into Docker or anything until we can get enough feedback from everyone. We do have them available as far as in the GitLab.cncf CI though, which has a container repository. So you could use this for the Kubernetes. So we could, all of the Kubernetes runs, we're going to run the performance test, we push the containers up, and then you can say, okay, it's gone through here, especially when we give you access to the API. And you could look back and see those builds, and you go, okay, we want to pull those. This is where we'd like to pull it. You could do that. Potentially, we're going to put them somewhere else. I don't know if that's going to be in Docker or something else like that. Yeah. It's always happening. How are we on time? About 10 minutes. Well, no more questions. We could end early. We could do some stretching. Anything else? All good?